On December 10, 2025, in a small town in northwestern Poland called Mazewo, a crane removed a 7-foot stone obelisk from a public square. It had stood there since 1947. Carved into it, in Russian, "Glory to the Liberators." March 7, 1945. The day it came down, a Polish official stood beside it and said, "There is no place for Soviet objects in a free Poland." The world barely noticed. But the question that moment quietly opens is this: if the people who built that monument called them liberators, and the people who tore it down call them occupiers, which version of history are we living inside? On June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. It was the largest military invasion in the history of warfare. What followed wasn't a conventional battle between armies. It was a systematic attempt to destroy an entire civilization. By the time the war ended, the Soviet Union had lost roughly 26 million people. More than half of them civilians dead from starvation, siege, and atrocities that still have no equivalent in the modern record. For every American soldier who died in the Second World War, the Soviet Union lost roughly 60. 3 out of every 4 German military fatalities from the entire war happened on the Eastern Front. Not in Normandy, not in North Africa. On the Eastern Front. And yet, the version of the war most people in the West grew up with begins on a beach in France in June 1944. On April 23, 2026, a historian named Jochen Hellbeck stood before an audience at Harvard University and offered a simple, devastating reframe. Hellbeck is a distinguished professor of history at Rutgers University, and his work rests on something no Western historian had ever been given access to before: a Soviet wartime archive containing hundreds of oral histories and photographs collected during the war itself and sealed for decades. His argument is this: Nazi Germany did not view Britain or America as its primary enemy. The existential threat, in Hitler's own political framework, was Communist Russia, what the Nazis themselves called world enemy number 1. The logic ran deep. The Nazis believed the Jewish revolutionaries had seized control of Russia in 1917 and were now using the Soviet state as a weapon to destroy Germany and the world. They called this ideology Judeo-Bolshevism, a fusion of anti-Semitism and anti-communism into a single apocalyptic hatred. That hatred is what ignited Operation Barbarossa. And Soviet lands, Hellbeck argues, became ground zero for systematic extermination, a violence that was only later extended to all Jews across Europe, igniting the Holocaust as we know it. The standard understanding of the Holocaust traces it entirely to racial anti-Semitism. Hellbeck isn't denying that. He is adding a dimension the West has systematically overlooked: that the machinery of extermination was set in motion specifically during the war against a communist enemy the Nazis had already coded as Jewish. The Eastern Front wasn't a sideshow to the real war. The Eastern Front was the war. When Hellbeck's book appeared in Germany, his own country, the reception was cold. He was told in various forms that the established history of the Holocaust, as Germans understand it, must not be overturned. Hellbeck doesn't believe he's overturning it. He says he's widening the frame, adding a political dimension to a narrative that German memory has kept purely in the register of racial evil. But Germany's post-war identity is built so tightly around a specific account of the Holocaust that even a credentialed historian adding a dimension to that story meets resistance. Not from political extremists, from the educated establishment, which raises a question worth sitting with. If even Germany, the country that has arguably gone further than any other to confront its Nazi past, has walls around what can be re-examined, what does that tell us about where historical truth actually lives? The answer, at least partly, is that the Western narrative of the Second World War was not written by historians. It was written by the Cold War. The version most Western audiences grew up with: D-Day, Churchill, and Roosevelt. The liberation of Paris was shaped during the decades when the Soviet Union was not an ally but an adversary. The 26 million Soviet dead became an inconvenient footnote to a story that needed a cleaner set of heroes. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the narrative didn't correct itself. It fragmented. Poland remembered the Red Army as an occupier. Estonia and Latvia rebuilt their national identities around Soviet oppression. The suffering was real. but it was also used to rewrite what had come before. The monuments being torn down across Europe, and Russian officials say roughly half of all Soviet liberation monuments have now been removed. Following official state decisions are not simply statues. They are the visible surface of something deeper, a battle over who decides what World War II meant. In October 2025, Nagasaki City announced a proposed revision to the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum. The museum, which exists to commemorate Japan's experience as a victim of nuclear warfare, proposed to change its description of the Nanjing massacre. The new language would no longer call it a massacre. It would call it the Nanjing Incident, described as an event in which many civilians and prisoners of war were killed. China's foreign ministry responded, "The Nanjing massacre was a brutal crime. The evidence is irrefutable. The Tokyo trials ruled explicitly that what happened in Nanjing was a massacre, not a mere incident. The general held responsible was sentenced to death by hanging. The semantic shift matters. Incident implies something that occurred, perhaps regrettable, perhaps ambiguous. Massacre implies deliberate, organized, mass killing. The Tokyo trials didn't choose that word loosely. Changing it is not a museum update. It is a challenge to the legal outcomes of the post-war international order, and this is happening inside an atomic bomb museum, a space designed to position Japan as the greatest victim of the war. Japan has spent 8 decades inviting world leaders to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to witness its suffering. Meanwhile, history textbooks have replaced the phrase War of Japanese Aggression with the more neutral Sino-Japanese War. The term comfort women has been substituted with mobilization. Cabinet ministers visit a shrine where Class A war criminals are enshrined alongside ordinary soldiers. Peace memorial halls have quietly removed exhibits about external aggression, victim and aggressor. Depending on which museum you walk into, Japan is both and neither. Every year, the United Nations votes on a resolution with a simple title: Combating the Glorification of Nazism, Neo-Nazism, and Other Practices that Contribute to Fueling Racism and Intolerance. Russia has been submitting this resolution for almost 20 years. In the most recent vote, in late 2025, 119 countries supported it. 51 voted against. Among those voting against, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the 3 core Axis powers of the Second World War, voted against a UN resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism. The Western position has a coherent justification. The resolution is weaponized by Russia to retroactively justify its invasion of Ukraine under the pretext of denazification. That criticism is real. Russia's use of anti-Nazi rhetoric to legitimize military aggression has been well documented, and Western opposition to this particular resolution reflects that concern. But the visual fact of the vote is still irreducible. Whatever the political reasoning, the nations that built the post-war international order, the self-declared victors of the war against fascism, voted alongside the former Axis powers against condemning Nazi glorification. Russia's response was precise. A Russian diplomat stated that this vote shows the provisions of the UN Charter on Enemy States remain relevant. Most people have never heard of those provisions. Hidden inside Articles 53, 77, and 107 of the United Nations Charter are clauses written in 1945 to prevent Germany, Italy, Japan, and their allied states from resuming wars of aggression. They allow the original allied powers, which includes Russia and China, to take military action against these states without UN Security Council authorization if they are deemed to have resumed aggressive policies. These clauses have never been removed from the Charter. On November 21, 2025, the Chinese embassy in Japan posted images of these articles on social media. No editorial was needed, just the text and its implications. They are a legal fossil from 1945. Ghost language embedded in the architecture of the international order. Most assumed these provisions had been quietly retired decades ago. They haven't been, and they are now being cited publicly in diplomatic disputes. The Russian diplomat's comment after the 2025 UN vote: clearly it is still too early to remove these provisions. So here is where we are. A historian publishes the most comprehensive cross-national account of why the Second World War began, and his own country tells him the story cannot be disturbed. A nation dismantles its liberation monuments and legally reclassifies the army that defeated Nazism as an occupying force. An atomic bomb museum proposes to reclassify a massacre as an incident. 3 former Axis powers vote at the United Nations against a resolution condemning the glorification of the ideology that started the war, and buried in the legal text of the institution designed to prevent another such war, language from 1945 sits quietly, still in force, still pointing. History is not what happened. History is the version of what happened that survives the version nations protect, defend, curate, and sometimes go to considerable lengths to revise. What we're watching now, across Europe and Asia, and the floor of the United Nations, is not a debate about the past. It is a battle over the future, fought with the weapons of memory. Go back to Maceió, to the 7-foot obelisk in the square, to the words carved in stone for 78 years, "Glory to the liberators." The stone didn't change. The words didn't change. What changed was the country standing around it, and the story that country had decided to tell about itself. History doesn't rewrite itself. People rewrite it, and they almost always have a reason.